This is something that's exercising my thoughts these days. It has been for several years. It's one of my main thought projects. I want to begin with Virginia Woolf, not a great Christian apologist, but she is one of the most famous literary figures of the 20th century. She's English. She has an incredibly tragic life, but she wrote some great literature. And she wrote on this question of meaning. What is the meaning of life? That was all. A simple question, one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. So, the simple question, what is the meaning of life? Easy to drop in a conversation. So, what is the meaning of life? So easy to throw out, but actually, does the answer come? Is there a revelation that makes sense of this? Because I believe meaning is the ultimate question that humans can ask. Now, what interests me, I'm covering a lot of ground, just touching on things, but up until quite recently, the meaning question didn't get much visible attention. I think throughout history, wherever you look, the meaning question has been taken for granted. It's just been there in the background. All human experience functioned with a kind of presupposition that there is meaning, and you didn't question that fact. But we live today in a climate where this foundation, I would say for the first time in all of history, has been eroded. Naturalism has eviscerated meaning, so it's now become out in the open like never before. And that is our opportunity. And I want to argue in this talk that our apologetics must much more directly engage meaning, because it's the question that has for the first time come into the open, and Christianity is the great revelation Virginia Woolf was looking for. It is the great revelation that uncovers meaning. So let me give you two reasons. Here's my apologetic to you apologists, why we have to take meaning seriously. And the first is this. Everyone, every human is a ravenous meaning seeker. Hungry. We're all hungry for meaning. And that should be a key part of our anthropology. We understand human persons as being hungry for meaning. So we are wired, all of us, in terms of how God has made us, with an awareness and hunger for meaning. Now, one of the great 20th century thinkers on the subject of meaning, way ahead of his time, is an Austrian neurologist called Viktor Frankl. And he developed meaning, I think, in a remarkable way, and has been one of the guys I've really mined. And this is a point he labored, that the deepest drive of a human is not Freud's will to pleasure, it's the will to meaning. Lots of people find meaning in things that are not pleasurable. The deepest drive, he said, is the human will to meaning. He wrote, for man's primary concern is not self-fulfillment, but fulfillment of meaning. And the mind is healthy, he wrote, when it has achieved a sufficient store of meaning. And man's search for meaning, this is important, because meaning was a joke 3 or 4 decades ago. Man's search for meaning is not pathological, but rather the surest sign of being truly human. Even if this search is frustrated, it cannot be considered a sign of disease. It is spiritual distress, not mental disease. Frankl's not a believer, but he's putting his finger on a very key insight. So everyone seeks meaning. And everyone does that because, as the French philosopher Chantal de Sales puts it, meaning is the salt of existence. Meaning adds flavor to life. Without meaning, all life would be bland and insipid and featureless. So I love de Sales, meaning is the salt of existence. And so because we're wired for meaning, we could also say we're condemned to meaning. Every human is condemned to meaning. No one can back out of the search for it and say, that's not for me. And it's interesting, even the nihilist, who says with the writer of Ecclesiastes, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. They haven't got out of the meaning search. That is a meaningful statement about meaning. You can never escape it. We're condemned to meaning. So because it's the central drive urge, longing for humans, we have to take it seriously. And I don't think we have. Secondly, we are presently living in a moment where there's a colossal meaning deficit. I would say the real pandemic of our time is that people don't have enough meaning for their lives to flourish. Again, Frankl gives expression to this in one of his books called The Feeling of Meaninglessness. People are lacking the awareness of a meaning worth living for. They're haunted by the experience of their inner emptiness, a void within themselves. They're caught in that situation that I have called an existential vacuum, a meaning deficit. And what I mean thereby is the experience of a total lack or loss of an ultimate meaning to one's existence that would make life worthwhile. Now, we live in so many ironies. A good apologist today should look at the ironies of modernity. One of them is this: on the material side, we've never had it so good. Never been more comfortable, more well-fed, looked after by healthcare and social care. And yet, alongside all of this material prosperity, on the internal side of our lives, what's inside us is feeling and awareness, we've never been so empty. So modern people generally aren't living with enough meaning to support their internal life. Jordan Peterson, someone who's passionate about the meaning deficit, he said, our current miraculous state of relative peace and economic tranquility should not blind us to the fact that gaping holes remain in our spirits. Those gaping holes being a meaning deficit. Now, there is a growing body of research out there that bears this conclusion out, that we're living in a meaning deficit with devastating consequences. The World Health Organization reports that global suicide rates have spiked 60% since World War II in our time of material prosperity. Around 1 million people take their own lives every year. Now, that's a staggering statistic given how good life is on the material side. Now, when you look at the research that's emerging on the subject of suicide, a global trend emerges. Countries which have where the meaning deficit is greatest are the places where the suicide rates are highest, United States and Japan. And people are making the correlation. Now, what's really interesting is that this meaning deficit is actually being taken very seriously by secular thinkers in all the disciplines. In the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of literature that is devoted to meaning. It's out in the open. So rather than being taken for granted, we're now taking hold of the subject of meaning itself because there's this deficit. Emily Smith is someone who's written a book on meaning. It's called The Power of Meaning. And she says, this research, growing body of it, on meaning reflects a broader shift in our culture. Across the country and across the world, educators, business leaders, doctors, politicians, and ordinary people are beginning to turn away from the gospel of happiness and focus on meaning. That's very significant. The gospel of happiness to a focus on meaning. So there's two reasons why we have to engage it. We're hungry for meaning, all humans as part of the anthropology, and there's a massive meaning deficit. That's our opportunity. So, as apologists, how do we engage this subject of meaning? Well, this is only an outline. As I said, it's my present thought project, lots of research and reading, hopefully working towards something in writing. It's a massive subject. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest. So I want to stand back for a moment and ask, what is meaning? Well, that would be interesting to open it up. We won't do it here, but that's actually something very difficult to define. Meaning's not easy to get your hands around. It's almost impossible to make abstract. It's a little bit like time. Time's hard to talk about. You can't just break it out of reality and submit time to a law of logic. And I've not yet come up with the killer definition or seen the killer definition of what meaning is. Meaning just is. It just is. And that means it doesn't submit to true or false. You can't bring the epistemology of truth easily to meaning. And actually, meaning doesn't even fit moral categories easily of right or wrong. I say that because lots of people find deep meaning in horribly depraved things, but they find it meaningful. A sadist finds meaning in torturing other people. So it is a meaning for them, and of course, totally wrong, but meaning itself, in terms of that experience, it doesn't just clearly fit into right or wrong. I think the one thing we can affirm about meaning is that it belongs to the world of the personal. It's something a human experiences in their awareness of the world. It's not in abstract thinking. Meaning is in connection to the real world. It flows out of being in touch with the worlds. So meaning is what happens when a human meaning seeker is connected or attended to reality. Not logic, it's not morality. It arises from connection of human subject to what is beyond us. Now, Ian McGilchrist is one of my hero thinkers, the master in his emissary. He's the one who talks about the divided hemisphere, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. He's written a lot about meaning also. One of his books is The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning. So the brain has two hemispheres, and both hemispheres have a completely different modus operandi. Now, McGilchrist argues that meaning occurs in the right hemisphere. So he writes, the right hemisphere's world is present, or more precisely, presence is to us, as Heidegger puts it. By contrast, the left hemisphere's world takes over once whatever it is represented, literally represented after the fact, once it's familiar and known as an instance of something, a concept. So he says the right hemisphere connects us, presences us to the real world, one that's alive and dynamic and therefore meaningful, where the left hemisphere disconnects, narrows in so we can conceptualize, give something clarity. Now, both are required, and when they work together, this is how God intended us to be. But the left hemisphere never meant to outweigh the right hemisphere, is where we connect for meaning. And actually, this is the point McGilchrist is making in that book. The left hemisphere tells us that the quest for meaning is meaningless, because it's not equipped to deal in meaning or understanding, but in manipulating and processing, what we call abstracting. So he's just saying meaning isn't abstract, it's personal and flows from being in touch with the world, present to reality. Now, when we begin to think about meaning, what is meaning? Hard to answer that question. I think we have to appreciate that it's two-sided. There's a subject side to meaning, what's meaningful for me, what's meaningful for you, and there's also an object side to meaning. So meaning isn't completely arbitrary and self-created. Most modern thinkers go down that line. It's self-created. But as Christians, we'd say there's actually meaning beyond our heads, as I'll show you in a moment, beyond our awareness of the world. There's a whole world outside of us that's deeply meaningful. And again, Frankl is on to this point. Frankl says we don't just attach and attribute meanings to things, rather we find them. We don't invent them, we detect them. Now, the secular understanding, lots of philosophers now dealing directly with meaning, they're strong on the first side, the subject side, what's meaningful for us. They have little to say on the other side, the object side of meaning, the world beyond our heads. As Christians and as apologists, we have a huge amount to say to both sides, which needs to be part of our apologetic. So I want to start with the object side, meaning's object side. Now, we have a basis for asserting real meaning outside of our heads in the mind-blowing statement, creation is meaning. That's the presupposition of meaning for Christians. Creation is meaning. And for you philosophers, when you use the word is, you're now in the realms of ontology. You're looking at the isness, the essence of something. And I actually think, we won't get sidetracked here, but in terms of my philosophical understanding, this is the most profound ontological statement you can make about God's creation. It is meaning. Isness is something, a way to get to the center of something, the fundamental aspect of something. And Christianity can assert that when it comes to the creation, its essence is meaningful. Creation is meaning. And we have a warrant for asserting this, that because there's nothing in creation that doesn't have meaning. Everything's meaningful, including the bad, including the evil side of it. And why can we say that? Well, it can get complex, but we stand back and first say it because creation has a creator, a personal, infinite God who intentionally and lovingly made this world. Well, from that, everything is going to have meaning. It's not here by chance. It's not here by accident. It was a deeply meaningful act on the part of the person who made it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. There's enough meaning there to keep us going for hours. So a personal creator is the presuppositional of meaning. And here's we come to the point I said we're condemned to meaning. Well, here's the reason why. If creation is meaning, you can never get away from it. We're condemned to it. Jared Manley Hopkins gets at this in his incredible poem, God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. That's a meaning statement. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Then he goes on, nature is never spent. There lives in the dearest freshness deep down things, deep down meaning. So as his handiwork, creation is charged and crammed with multiple layers of meaning. I would say meaning is inexhaustible within God's world. And part of this ontology we work is that we can trace the meaning, show the relationships between things and why it's meaningful. Now that's something a naturalist can't do. They can't assert that. They can address the subject side of meaning, what's meaningful for us, but on the object side, there's a deafening silence. Because in a world that's merely matter, that came accidentally and by chance, it's hard to assert meaning in that. We still have to, but it's hard to verify and give warrant for it. Because the only thing you can actually say about nature is that it's blindly indifferent to our pursuit of meaning. God isn't indifferent to anybody's pursuit of meaning. It's part of the way he calls us to himself. But if someone committed suicide because they couldn't find enough meaning, nature is blindly indifferent. They don't even know. It has no awareness. It has no soul. It has no consciousness. Paul Bloom is an example of a thinker, popular thinker, who says we can't say much on the object side of meaning. And he begins his book by distinguishing the two sides, which is good. His book is called The Sweet Spot. He says meaning, objective meaning, is a difficult topic to write about. And he's right. There's a famous remark by the physicist Wolfgang Pauli dismissing the work of another scientist. He isn't right. He isn't even wrong. I often think about this while reading about meaning and purpose. The problem isn't usually that I disagree with what I read. It's that it's too fuzzy and vague and general to take seriously. He's saying we can't do much on the object side. Now, I find it really interesting looking today at the current attempts to rehabilitate meaning in the naturalist framework. There's this growing body of literature where philosophers see that humans can't survive without it. And most of them say we need some form of the supernatural. A few years back, two notable American philosophers, Herbert Dreyfus, Sean Kelly, Bruce Little's another one, but this is Herbert Dreyfus and Sean Kelly. They wrote a book, All Things Shining, reading the Western classics to find meaning in a secular age. And the argument is that for meaning, we have to live as if the gods existed. As if. And if we can reclaim the mythical tradition of the Greeks, we have a chance to recover meaning in our worlds. So live as if they existed. Jordan Peterson, be careful, He is not almost a Christian. We're thankful for where he's going. We pray for him. He's not almost a Christian. I read his maps of meaning. That's a hard read. And I heard him in Cambridge. He is very strongly Darwinian, and he's also Jungian. Here he is, a materialist. The Jungian side, how do we invest materialism with meaning? And he believes the recovery of high-level meaning is only through the ancient myths. But the primal matter of mythology, a more comprehensive substance than the matter of the modern world, is much more than mere substance. Mythology is the source of everything, objective and subjective. We could study that sentence for hours. So secular thinkers try to rehabilitate meaning through the myths. Now, as apologists, we don't have to smuggle in myths because we live in the one true story. That's so meaningful. And we operate with a doctrine of creation that's so substantive that we can assert creation is meaning, including the realm of the supernatural. Right, that's the object side, just briefly, in terms of an outline. Let's move now to meaning subject side. Because at the end of the day, the meanings of creation have to become meaningful for us as subjects. Now, Michael Polanyi, not best known for this work, he wrote a very important book on meaning with the title, Meaning. I like authors who just name what they're doing. Meaning. He said, man lives in the meanings he is able to discern. He extends himself into that which he finds coherent and is at home there. These meanings can be of many kinds and sorts. Men believe in the reality of these meanings wherever they perceive them. So we discern what's meaningful for us. So the point is, it's not just enough to say creation is meaning. We also have to address how this becomes meaningful for us in our awareness. Now, I've crafted, and here's where we're going to end. I've crafted what I'm going to call the quadrilateral of meaning. This is after Wesley's famous quadrilateral in terms of an epistemology. But here's a quadrilateral of meaning that actually my reading on people of meaning, they all seem to come to something like this. So I thought, let's make a quadrilateral of it. So this summarizes how meaning works on the subject side. For the world to become meaningful for us, these four things are required. And each occurs as we're in touch with the real world, not abstractly, but related and connected. And to some degree, if something is meaningful, all four of the quadrants are going to be activated for us. So it could be true for something as small, you could say, as cooking a meal for friends who are coming around that evening. Or for something as crazy as scaling El Capitan in Yosemite Park. You guys seen Free Solo? The guy who went up El Capitan without ropes? A lot of meaning in that film. Also, quadrilateral here of suffering when we're in the sorrowful place. So just briefly, I want to look at each part of the quadrant and how it works for meaning, and then just finish by showing how Christianity offers such high-level meaning on the subject side in all four parts of the quadrant. So first of all, coherence. For something to be meaningful, we have to be able to make sense of it. It has to cohere for us. And that means there has to be a sense of harmony, a sense of integration. So you see and you sense how it fits together, what binds it. You make sense of it. It has coherence. So you're cooking a meal for your friends, and first of all, you make sense of the recipe. My wife says I struggle there, but I try to make sense of the recipe. And then as I sweat in the kitchen, I do like cooking, I think, this makes sense what I'm doing here, the filth and the mess and the dishes everywhere, because our friends are coming round. That makes sense of that activity. It adds the meaning to what I'm doing. Now, the opposite is incoherence, where things, you can't make sense of your present activity. I think many people today experience that in their work. They're tiny cogs in this giant machine, and they can't make sense of how their little cog turning does anything in the big picture. Then work doesn't become coherent. We can't make sense of it. I think it's worth adding here that story is essential to coherence. And the richer the story we're in, the more coherence we find from making sense of it. I think in Weber's famous iron cage, we live within an ahistorical framework. Secular people are so impoverished in story. This has been well said by many, inside and outside Christianity. But that's diminished meaning as coherence. The loss of a great story is a loss of making sense of your life. So it's part of the meaning deficit. Okay, the next one, purpose. Something becomes meaningful to us to the degree that we know what it's for. Purpose is a little bit future directed. Nietzsche, he who has a why, a purpose, can live with any how. The why gives the meaning. This is the purpose, and I can live with any how if I know the why. So the purpose of me sweating in the kitchen, making a mess, struggling with a recipe, is knowing what's going to happen at 6:30. The doorbell's going to sound. And my friends are going to come in, and we're going to uncork the bottle, and we're going to have great conversation and lots of laughter. That's beautiful. That's what this is for. It helps add to the meaning of that experience of cooking. So when our lives have clear purpose, is directed to realistic and good goals, life becomes meaningful. And this always includes the task. Purpose includes our task. Viktor Frankl, he developed his theories around meaning or reshaped them when he was in the death camps of the Nazis. He was at Auschwitz, not far from here. He was actually in 4 Nazi death camps. And as a psychiatrist, neurologist, passionate about meaning, and it's called logotherapy, he said those who had a task and a purpose that reached beyond Auschwitz, many of them survived. Those who couldn't see anything but beyond Auschwitz died. There wasn't enough meaning to keep them going. This is his book, if you haven't read, A Man's Search for Meaning. This is the popularization of his thesis, but in the story of what he experienced in the death camps. So that's purpose. The third one is significance. And in this quadrant, we arrive at the reason that something matters. So significance adds the depth and the weight to what you're doing. So you're an exhausted mother. We have one. Parents here of young children. You're absolutely exhausted. And you're reading to your little child when the house is a wreck, and you say, what's the meaning of this? Well, what adds the depth is this little person is so precious. It's more important than my tidy house. So I'm just going to keep reading to them. And that adds the significance, the depth to the experience. Now, we haven't much time to probe this. We've touched on it a little bit, but it's really interesting that modern thinkers on the subject of meaning, secular humanists, are telling us that significance needs transcendence. That's what really adds the depth. Something becomes deeply meaningful to the degree that it's significance because of this element of the supernatural. You can't just explain it in naturalistic terms. One of my heroes, a tragic figure too, is David Foster Wallace. American thinker, essay writer, one of the great American public intellectuals who committed suicide out of depression, but I think a loss of meaning. He said that one of his most significant meaning experiences was being on center court, being there, Wimbledon, and watching Roger Federer play. That takes you to another realm. And I've had that experience in a sporting arena. You look what someone can do and you think, wow, where did that come from? That's significance. The significance of a weight that you can't just explain through technical sports science. That's part of the thesis in All Things Shining from Hubert and Kelly. They call it the flow or the rush, and they say you get it in the sporting arena. Your team scores a goal. I'm a Liverpool supporter. Big day for us today. Could win, might not win. But anyway, your team scores the goal and 60 people go, they say that's meaningful. And they say there's something transcendent in that whoosh. Now, I want more than whoosh for my meaning, but I know what they're getting at. That adds significance. The fourth one is belonging. I'm not going to say much here, but for an experience to be meaningful, it's necessary to know how we fit into it. So humans experience deep meaning in belonging, in participating, in sharing, in fitting in. It's funny, I know lots of recovering alcoholics, and for them, Belonging is Alcoholics Anonymous, a remarkable organization of belonging. That's where their meaning is found. Very, very precious for them. And I think in a world that's increasingly fragmented, where people don't know where they belong, this is critical to the recovery of meaning. That's why people join local choirs and become in crazy clubs in England. They want this belonging. Now, there's so much more we could add to all of this, but this is how meaning works for us on the subjective level. Now, for the point I'm want to make now is that Christianity is freighted with the highest level of meaning in all four parts of the quadrant. And I think we can demonstrate that very quickly. So in terms of coherence, we live within a biblical worldview that really does make sense of everything. And our worldview includes the grand story, what Newman calls cosmic history. So there's nothing we look at that we can't give coherence to in terms of creation, fall, redemption, final destiny. There's nothing that you can't bring that to. It brings so much coherence. And then in terms of purpose, what's the meaning of life? I asked Pete Saunders at the airport when I first met him 2 days ago. He said, well, it's already been said, Andrew. We need to glorify God and enjoy him forever. He's absolutely right. That's the purpose of our human existence. And on the basis of Christ's work, our life is really going somewhere. We have a task to serve him. And we also live in the reality of the greatest significance. We live, as Schaeffer said, in the reality of the supernatural. Bruce and I share this in common. We love Schaeffer. Going to get a lot of Schaeffer whenever we talk. You need to bring him back, but that was for him so real. We live in the reality of the supernatural moment by moment. That's the significant Holy Spirit indwelling us. And then, of course, we have belonging. The deepest kind of belonging to Christ and to each other. And I love a conference like this. Normally they say there's 7 degrees of separation. You meet anyone on the planet, between you and that person, you'll find 7 links at the maximum that connects you. With Christians, it's 2. So you think, someone you've never met before from a foreign place, and you start talking, oh yeah, I know him, I know them. And I love it when that sense of belonging is established. We moved a year ago. We're getting to know our neighbors. And our closest neighbor, in this conversation, you're kind of sort of scouting each other. Where are you coming from? And he used a biblical phrase, and I used one. And then it's just, bing, we're both Christians in the sense of, belonging. Deeply, deeply meaningful. So the point is this, in this moment of crisis, it is a crisis. People are committing suicide because of the deficit. We have a unique opening as apologists, and I don't think we've engaged it. Some of you here are more experienced than I'm in apology, but I don't think we've directly enough engaged meaning, and that's what I'm arguing for. That's my apologetic for you guys this morning.